They say that truth is stranger than fiction, but sometimes fiction is the scaffolding that holds up our truths. Imagine, for a moment, a world where the shape of the earth is less important than the monsters it contains. A time when maps did not simply chart coastlines or record rivers, but served as mirrors for the fears of an entire civilization. This was medieval Europe, a place not merely ruled by kings and clergy, but by stories. And among these stories, tucked quietly into the margins of crumbling parchment and golden ink, were the Blemmye, men with no heads, their eyes and mouths sewn into the middle of their chests. They were not confined to fairy tales or bedtime myths. No, they were recorded by some of the most trusted chroniclers of the ancient and medieval world. And even more curiously, they were drawn by cartographers with such confidence, one might almost believe these creatures were common knowledge, like rivers, mountains, or capital cities. But how could that be? Why would people who mapped continents, who charted stars and tracked eclipses, believe in a race of headless beings? Is it possible they saw something we no longer understand? Or were they blinded not by darkness, but by their own light, by the certainty that the world beyond their borders was filled not with people, but with monsters? What truth hides behind a myth that refuses to die? Tonight, let us drift quietly into the past, past the mists of medieval superstition, and into the cold precision of ink scratched onto vellum. Our story begins not in the mind of a madman, but in the pages of history's most revered texts. The Roman author, Pliny the Elder, in his grand encyclopedic work, Natural History, speaks of the Blemmye as real and distant people who live somewhere beyond Nubia. He describes them without mockery, almost clinically, as if describing giraffes or crocodiles. Herodotus, too, the so-called father of history, mentions similar beings in his descriptions of the distant lands of Libya. These were not tales meant to entertain. They were accounts meant to inform. Later, in the Middle Ages, as knowledge fragmented and fused with theology, the Blemmye did not vanish. They only grew more vivid. Maps like the Hereford Mappa Mundi and the Ebstorf map, creations of learned men working in religious institutions, depict the Blemmye in the unexplored corners of the earth, far from the sacred center of Jerusalem. Often, they are grouped with other monstrous races, dog-headed cynocephaly, men with giant feet used as umbrellas, or those with no mouths who fed on the smell of apples. Yet it is the Blemmye who linger most unsettlingly in the imagination, perhaps because their form is almost human. Almost. A cruel parody of it. They walk upright. They wear clothing. But the absence of a head makes them alien, animal, and terrifying. Why then did these maps matter? Because in the medieval world, maps were not navigational tools. They were theological diagrams, visual sermons. They showed not where things were, but what they meant. The further you traveled from the sacred, the closer you came to chaos. And at the edges of the known world lived those who were known only by fear. But was it only fear that placed the Blemmye on these maps? Or was it guilt? Projection? A refusal to see humanity in the unfamiliar? If we look closer, if we soften our gaze and let the silence of the centuries settle into our ears, we may begin to hear something unexpected. A whisper, almost apologetic, beneath the loud declarations of monstrosity. Some scholars have suggested that the Blemmye were not figments of imagination at all, but distorted references to real people. Perhaps the Beja tribes of Sudan, known to the Greeks and Romans, who may have worn headdresses, carried weapons across their chests, or simply looked different enough to be reimagined by curious or frightened observers. Could it be that the Blemmye were a racialized invention? That Europe's fear of the other was literalized in the body of a headless man? Or perhaps it was simpler still. A traveler saw what he could not explain, and the mind filled in the blanks with what it feared most. But even then, why persist with such an image for centuries? Why copy it, recopy it, etch it into the stone walls of cathedrals and the margins of illuminated manuscripts? Why did artists, monks, and scholars all across Europe reproduce this figure over and over again, long after they knew the world was round and the oceans had been crossed? Perhaps it is because the Blemmye served a purpose, not a geographic one, but a spiritual one. They reminded the viewer that evil, chaos, and disorder were always out there, just beyond the last known port. That the civilized world was fragile, surrounded by beings who defied the natural order, who walked upright but lacked the seat of reason, the symbol of divine image, the head. There is something disturbingly elegant about the Blemmye. In their headless form, they are a perfect metaphor for everything medieval Europeans feared about the unfamiliar. They are not animals to be hunted, nor demons to be exorcised. They are too human for that, but not quite human enough to be spared. And in this in-between space, they become a canvas onto which 1,000 anxieties were painted. What does it mean to be human? Who decides? Where does civilization end and monstrosity begin? Tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts drift like ancient ships across a quiet sea, consider this. The Blemmye may not have been real in the way we define reality today, but they were real to those who drew them, real enough to fear, real enough to place on maps. And if that fear has shaped the stories we tell, the borders we build, and the strangers we distrust, then perhaps the Blemmye are not as distant as they seem. Sleep now, with the soft rustle of parchment echoing in the background. Somewhere, in the corners of a forgotten map, they are still watching. Close your eyes now and imagine a map, not the kind you're used to. No scale bars or latitude lines. No roads connecting cities or highways snaking through suburbs. Instead, this map is more like a tapestry, its surface dense with symbols and scripture, with saints and sinners, with dragons, lions, angels, and rivers shaped like snakes. At the center, always, lies Jerusalem, Earth's spiritual heart, and at its edges, the edges are wild, unreadable, and alive. For in the medieval mind, to map the earth was not merely to record terrain, but to inscribe the known upon the unknown, the divine upon the dangerous. These were not tools of navigation, but declarations of worldview, theology drawn in ink and gold. In these sacred diagrams, monsters were not mistakes, they were warnings. The Blemmye, headless but sentient, stood among them like dark omens carved into the skin of knowledge. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the year 1300 and still preserved in Hereford Cathedral today, stretches nearly 5 feet across and over 4 feet tall. It is a thing of beauty and of strange dread. It contains more than 1,000 inscriptions, cities, and biblical events, but its real purpose is not to direct travel. It is to show order, divine at the center, chaos at the edge. And there, near the Nile, in what the mapmakers considered the fringes of the world, the Blemmye appear. Not in shadow, but clearly rendered. They are not hidden. They are exhibited. Their bodies upright, their faces painted in their chests. They seem almost calm, serene even, as if unaware they have become emblems of something Europe dared not name. Why were they drawn with such care? Why were they believed? To answer that, we must enter the medieval imagination, and that is no easy task. For to think like a mapmaker in the 13th century is to see the world not as a place of data, but of meaning. The map was a story. Its geography was moral, not empirical. Every river could be a vein of sacred history, every mountain a stairway to heaven or a hiding place for sin. In this world, monsters were necessary. They proved the centrality of Christian civilization by standing outside it. Their physical deformity reflected spiritual deficiency, and yet, paradoxically, they were also fascinating. The monstrous races were not wholly condemned. Sometimes they were saved, even holy. Theologians debated whether the Blemmye had souls. Could a man with no head be baptized? Could Christ's image reside in a chest? These were not idle questions. They were debates that shaped the boundaries of mercy. Still, fear lingered. The farther from Jerusalem a being lived, the more distorted it became, until the distortion itself became the proof. And here we begin to see the paradox at the heart of medieval geography. It claimed divine order, yet it teetered on the edge of chaos. Maps promised understanding, but in doing so, confessed their terror of what could not be understood. The Blemmye haunted this tension perfectly. They were neither demon nor man, neither animal nor angel. They existed between categories, and therefore threatened all categories. But why the Blemmye? Why this form? Why headlessness? It is not merely grotesque. It is symbolically rich. The head was the seat of reason, of speech, of identity. To have a face on one's chest was to place feeling before thought, hunger before prayer. It was to walk upright, but think downward. The Blemmye were Europe's unconscious fears made flesh. What if those outside the known world were not simply different, but capable? Capable of thought, of culture, of rebellion, capable of proving Europe wrong. Acknowledging their humanity would mean confronting colonial humility. Denying it meant safety. And so, they were flattened into legend. But legends, especially persistent ones, often contain kernels of forgotten reality. And here, the line begins to blur. For outside of maps and myths, in the dry heat of northeastern Africa, the Blemmye may have walked in another form. The term Blemmies appears in Roman and Byzantine texts to describe a group of people living in Nubia, in what is now Sudan and southern Egypt. They were known to be fierce warriors, sometimes allied with the kingdom of Kush, sometimes hostile to Roman Egypt. They left behind pottery, fortresses, ruins. They were not mythical. They were real. And yet, over time, their image transformed. From political adversaries to curiosities to caricatures. Was it ignorance or something deeper? Was it perhaps easier for an empire to defeat a monster than to acknowledge a rival? In cartographic silence, we find echoes of cultural noise. The Blemmye were remembered not by their words or achievements, but by how they were drawn, literally. Rendered by the hands of monks and mapmakers who may never have seen them, their image became a cipher, a symbol open to projection. And so, as the ink dried, the lie became a kind of truth. They were feared not because they were monstrous, but because they were other. And in the fearful imagination, otherness becomes monstrosity. What happens then when maps lie? Or rather, when they reflect truths not about the world, but about the minds that made them? Can we still trust what they show? Or must we read them like dreams, symbols to be interpreted, not followed? The medieval map is a riddle in plain sight. It tells us that monsters exist, but not where they live. It shows us the boundaries of knowledge and the price paid to keep them. And it whispers, quietly, that perhaps the true monsters were not the ones drawn on the edges, but the fears and certainties penned into the center. Now rest, for the journey is only beginning. Let the inked borders blur, and the names of forgotten lands drift into mist. Somewhere, in the winding corridors of medieval memory, the Blemmye still walk, still watch, still wait. When we peel away the gilded surface of medieval myth, what remains beneath is often stranger than the stories themselves. The Blemmye are no exception. They were said to be headless, yes, but not faceless. Their eyes and mouths, somehow migrated down to their chests, offered the illusion of humanity, distorted. It is this contradiction, this tightrope walk between man and monster, that grants them their terrible elegance. But the deeper we look, the more tangled the roots become. Because the Blemmye are not a medieval invention, they are older, far older. They echo through centuries of literature, from Rome to Byzantium, even earlier still, and their presence in these texts suggests something more unsettling than fantasy: the possibility that they were not created from imagination, but from encounter, distorted, misunderstood, and deliberately reshaped. We begin with Pliny the Elder, the Roman author and naturalist whose Naturalis Historia stands as one of the most ambitious encyclopedias of the ancient world. In Book 5, he describes the Blemmye as a tribe of people living in Nubia, beyond the boundaries of Egypt. He claims they have no heads, but instead their faces reside on their chests. Pliny does not ridicule them. He does not imply hallucination or myth. He lists them alongside real tribes, real rivers, real mountains. To him, they are part of geography, not mythology. His calm tone, his detached certainty, suggests belief without question. Was this trust in secondhand reports? Or were there indeed stories circulating in the empire that described something strange, something that, once exaggerated by distance and mistranslation, became the Blemmye? Herodotus, writing centuries before Pliny, offers even older echoes. Though he does not use the name Blemmye, he mentions tribes in Libya that exhibit unnatural characteristics: long limbs, silent speech, or monstrous forms. These were not simply meant to scare. They were observations passed from traveler to scribe, filtered through layers of fear, awe, and misunderstanding. The people being described may have looked unfamiliar. Perhaps they wore ceremonial garb that obscured the head or displayed facial symbols on the chest. Perhaps they fought in ways that seemed otherworldly. Perhaps they simply moved through the landscape in patterns unknown to Greek logic. From these scattered reports, an image begins to form, an image shaped more by the viewer than the subject. Even Roman military reports reference peoples south of Egypt in regions where the empire never fully penetrated. These people, fiercely independent, often resisted Roman control. The term Blemmye may have originated here as a misheard name or as a convenient label for those whom Rome could not subdue. In this way, the Blemmye were not just monsters, they were enemies. And enemies, once dehumanized, become easier to erase. But perhaps the most telling detail lies in the cartographic persistence of the Blemmye across centuries, even as knowledge of the world expanded. By the High Middle Ages, Europe had access to Arabic geography, to travelers' accounts, even to the early stirrings of empirical observation. And yet, the Blemmye did not vanish. They were still drawn, still believed in. Why? because belief in the monstrous other served a function. It reinforced the idea that the known world, Europe, Christendom, the Latin-speaking sphere, was the pinnacle of order. Beyond it lay chaos, savagery, inversion. And what better symbol of inversion than a man without a head? To understand the Blemmye fully, we must understand their place not just in myth, but in the evolving relationship between center and periphery, empire and frontier. They were described not just to entertain, but to warn. They were a cipher for everything the civilized world did not want to recognize in itself. Their headlessness suggested a lack of reason, of logic, of speech. But is this not also a confession of fear? A fear that those outside the known world might think differently, speak differently, live differently, and yet still be whole. Ethnographers today approach such historical accounts with caution. What appears monstrous in the texts of the past often reveals itself as cultural misinterpretation, scarification, ritual adornment, headgear, body paint. These can all appear shocking to eyes trained by narrow norms. When Europeans described African, Indian, or indigenous American tribes, they often filtered their observations through moral or theological lenses. They asked not, "What is this?" but "How unlike us is this?" And from that question grew myths like the Blemmye. Some speculate that descriptions of the Blemmye were drawn from distant travelers' attempts to describe real people. A warrior tribe with elaborate chest armor might seem, from afar, like their faces glinted from their torsos. A community with customs around veiling or obscuring the head might be remembered by listeners as headless. These are not absurd assumptions. They are how memory and fear interact. And in a world where writing was sacred and drawing was limited to the elite, these distorted impressions gained permanence. Once sketched onto a map, the distortion became fact. But there is another layer still, one more subtle, more haunting. The Blemmye may not have been merely misunderstood others. They may have been used by theologians, by artists, by chroniclers who wanted to speak not about geography, but about the soul. A man with no head cannot reason, cannot pray, cannot rise to heaven. And yet he walks. This was a warning not to travelers, but to the faithful. Do not stray too far. Do not wander into unfamiliar lands, unfamiliar thoughts. For beyond the edges of our truth, reason collapses. And so the Blemmye, once perhaps real people or real echoes of them, were absorbed into a larger mythology, a mythology that shaped how Europe saw the world and itself. They became not a reflection of the other, but of Europe's refusal to see the other clearly. In the end, we are left with a riddle. Were the Blemmye monsters invented to protect fragile minds from the unknown? Or were they the distorted mirror of real people, flattened by centuries of fear? And if the latter is true, if they were once flesh and voice and family, what have we lost in turning them into legend? Let this question echo as you fall deeper into sleep, deeper into forgotten maps and half-remembered stories. For in the silence of uncharted lands, history often whispers not what was, but what we needed to believe. Drift now to the edge of a world once flat, not in shape, but in thought. A world where heaven pressed close to the clouds and hell yawned beneath every crack in the earth. A world where knowledge had a center and sin had coordinates. In this world, maps were not just charts of the land, but scaffolds of meaning. And on these medieval maps, the edges were not blank. They were teeming, peopled, alive with creatures whose very anatomy defied reason. Dog-headed men who barked prayers into the night. Cannibals with mouths in their bellies. And yes, the headless Blemmye, forever gazing from their chests, forever lingering near the Nile like a dream misremembered. These were the monstrous races, and they were not hidden. They were displayed, deliberately, insistently, as if to say, this is what waits beyond the light. But what were these creatures really? Were they warnings, jokes, misread ethnographies? Or were they something far more cunning, projections of a civilization's need to define itself not by what it was, but by what it feared to become? The medieval worldview, shaped by faith and myth, saw the earth not as a neutral sphere, but as a divine canvas. Jerusalem stood at the center because it had to. Around it spiraled the moral geometry of Christian truth. Everything further from that center was more corrupt, more fallen, more monstrous. Geography became theology. Distance became deviance. And into that theological cartography were inserted the monstrous races. They were not randomly placed. They clustered in the farthest regions of Africa, Asia, and the mysterious lands to the east and south. Lands that most Europeans had never seen and would never see. Lands known only through rumor, scripture, and the haze of inherited texts. The Blemmye, with their displaced faces, became a symbol of inversion. People who looked human but were not. Who lived, walked, perhaps even spoke, but without the crown of the head, without the mark of God. What does it mean to place monsters at the edges of the world? It means the center can rest easy. It means civilization can sleep at night. Because if the darkness is out there, far away, then we are safe in here. And if the monsters are real, then perhaps our fears are justified. Perhaps our rules, our borders, our violence, all of it, can be explained. So the maps became tools, not of exploration, but of containment. They did not seek to reveal the world, but to tame it, to keep its terrors in the margins, carefully labeled, carefully framed. But here lies the paradox. The monstrous races were not always evil. In some manuscripts, they were simply different, curious creatures born of God's wide imagination. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's great minds, argued that even if such beings existed, they were still part of God's creation. If they descended from Adam, then they were human. Even the headless Blemmye, if they bore children, if they loved and fought and died, were to be considered souls. This tension between fear and inclusion, between awe and rejection, ran deep in medieval thought. It wasn't enough to banish the strange. One had to wrestle with it, theologize it, make room for it in a spiritual order that claimed universality. So the Blemmye were drawn again and again, not just because they scared, but because they provoked wonder. They reminded the viewer that the world was full of riddles, that even in God's kingdom, mystery had not been erased. And in the quiet corners of monastic scriptoriums, where hands moved slowly across parchment, perhaps a monk paused as he inked the outline of a headless man. Perhaps he wondered, not is this real, but what does this mean? For in those days, meaning mattered more than fact. And in that world, the Blemmye were not outliers. They were keys. Keys to what, though? That is the haunting question. Were they meant to unlock the geography of the soul, or to keep certain truths hidden, disguised as myth? Some scholars now suggest that the monstrous races, including the Blemmye, served a political purpose. that they justified crusades and conquests by painting the periphery as less than human, that they allowed for a theology of domination, where to bring civilization to the monstrous was not just an act of empire, but of mercy. If so, then the Blemmye were never monsters at all. They were victims, flattened into symbols, stripped of language, of memory, of voice. They were turned into margins on a map drawn by those who never intended to meet them. And yet, despite this, they endured. Their image traveled across centuries and kingdoms, from Rome to France, from the Byzantine court to English cathedrals, always on the edge, always almost forgotten. And what of today? We no longer draw maps with dragons and headless men, but do we not still imagine the unfamiliar as strange? Do we not still place fears at the edges of our vision, in distant lands, on distant screens? Perhaps the monstrous races have simply changed names. Perhaps the Blemmye still live in the spaces we refuse to understand, in the cultures we reduce to caricature, in the histories we never teach. Let your eyes soften now. Let the borders blur. For on the old maps of memory and myth, the Blemmye still linger, quietly reminding us that the edges we fear are often the truths we refuse to face. There is a kind of fear that does not shout. It does not bare its teeth or raise its voice. It whispers instead. It lingers in the corners of the known. It settles between what we understand and what we choose not to. And on medieval maps, this fear took form. It coiled around coastlines and curled into margins, dressed in fur and claw, or in the case of the Blemmye, in a strangely familiar skin. The maps themselves were quiet, their ink precise, their geometry divine. But the fear they carried was intimate, cunning, and deeply human. We must ask, what did the medieval mind fear, truly? Was it creatures with no heads? Was it tribes with unknown tongues? Or was it something closer to home, an inward terror projected outward? Perhaps the most unnerving thing about the Blemmye was not their form, but their resemblance. They looked almost human, and in that almost lay the unbearable tension. The line between self and other was too thin, too fragile. A face on a chest is not a demon. It is a mirror, slightly warped. And fear, when turned sideways, becomes recognition. So the Blemmye lingered not on the maps alone, but in the minds that made them, haunting the boundary between understanding and rejection. To chart a world is to confront the unknown, but in the medieval imagination, unknown did not mean empty. It meant occupied by the strange, the sinful, the damned. The blank spaces were not blank. They were filled with meaning. The further the distance from Europe's sacred core, the more imagination was needed to fill in the gaps. But imagination, in times of uncertainty, bends toward fear. And so the maps became a reflection not of the world's terrain, but of Europe's anxieties. Every monstrous race, every impossible creature was a symptom. The maps were sick with dread. The Blemmye sat quietly within this schema, both passive and potent. They did not attack. They did not breathe fire or curse the sky. They simply existed, wrongly. Their very bodies were errors, and yet they walked. They persisted. To the medieval viewer, that persistence was unnerving. It implied survival, and worse, agency. If a headless being could walk, could choose, could live, then perhaps the order of things was less solid than believed. Perhaps reason was not the exclusive domain of Europe. Perhaps the soul did not sit neatly behind the eyes. Perhaps the world was not as hierarchical as the theologians promised. And so the fear deepened. not of the Blemmye themselves, but of what they suggested. They became a question no one wanted to ask. What if our categories are wrong? What if monstrosity is not in the body, but in the gaze that sees it? A face in the chest is bizarre, yes, but is it less natural than the hatred that draws it as monstrous? These are not questions the map makers would have written in ink, but they are questions their work, unconsciously, asked. Fear thrives on silence. It survives in the unspoken rules of a worldview. In medieval Europe, difference was not just noted, it was moralized. To look different was to be spiritually suspect. The body was a battleground for the soul. And so the Blemmye's body, distorted from the familiar, became an emblem of internal disorder. They were not simply outside Europe, they were outside grace. Yet even as they served this function, their image betrayed a strange contradiction. For despite their alleged monstrosity, the Blemmye were often drawn with human dignity, upright, balanced, symmetrical even. Their eyes looked out with calm. Their mouths did not scream. They seemed almost meditative. It is as if the map makers, despite their inherited fear, could not help but see something human there, something unresolved. Here lies the psychology of cartographic fear. It is not the fear of beasts or ghosts. It is the fear of being wrong. The fear that the center does not hold, that those placed on the margins might deserve to be in the frame, that the world is wider, stranger, and more inclusive than we have prepared for. And so the margins must be thickened with warning signs. The maps must lie, gently but insistently, in order to preserve the illusion of control. Do we still draw such maps in our way? Not on parchment perhaps, but in pixels and headlines, in textbooks that erase inconvenient cultures, in policies that redraw borders through the lens of suspicion. The monsters may be gone, but the fear remains. And so the Blemmye endure, not as myths, but as memories of how power arranges knowledge. They are echoes of a time when fear was a function of distance, when the unknown could be turned into an image, bound to a name, and safely set aside. But those images, once drawn, never truly fade. They cling to the corners of history. They shape what we inherit. And sometimes they whisper back, "Now let your thoughts wander, like a traveler, unsure of the road. Let the noise of certainty fall away. For beyond the known lands, beyond the maps with names and borders, there is still a place where the Blemmye walk, silent, faceless, and very nearly seen. In the soft twilight of a fading candle, imagine the outline of a man, a body upright, shoulders square, arms by his side. He could be anyone, a soldier, a traveler, a scribe. But where the head should be, there is none. Instead, the face stares back from the chest, calm, unblinking, unspeaking. This is not horror in the way we understand it now. It is older, quieter, a different kind of wrongness. It unsettles not because it screams, but because it whispers that something has shifted, something fundamental. The image of the Blemmye is a riddle in flesh. It draws the eye and then refuses to explain itself. And in doing so, it opens the door to one of history's deepest habits, the making of the other. The monstrous body has always been a canvas for meaning. It reflects not the person being described, but the person doing the describing. In the medieval mind, bodies were symbols. They revealed the state of the soul. A straight spine signaled discipline. A pale complexion hinted at spiritual purity. But a body that defied anatomy, missing a head, stretching limbs, twisting proportions, that body was read as something else entirely. A warning, a deviation, a sin made visible. And so, the Blemmye, with their faces pressed into their chests, became living metaphors. Metaphors for disorder, for the foreign, for everything outside the borders of Christendom. But they were also mirrors, not of those who lived in far-off lands, but of Europe's own distorted fears. The Blemmye were not entirely animal. They were not completely beast. That's what made them so dangerous to the imagination. They hovered on the boundary of human, as if to say, this is what humanity might look like without divine guidance. They were not wild things to be hunted. They were fallen things to be pitied, or perhaps feared more deeply, because they reminded the viewer of what could be lost. In their strange anatomy, the Blemmye became a silent argument about morality. What happens to a person who loses their head, who no longer thinks, reasons, prays in the way the church prescribes? The answer was drawn in ink, on the very edges of sacred maps. The foreign other, in this medieval context, was never just about geography. It was about theology, politics, and control. If the Blemmye lived in distant Nubia or Ethiopia, that distance made them easier to distort. Few Europeans would ever meet a Nubian. Even fewer would understand their language, their culture, their worldview. And into that gap, between presence and absence, stepped the monster. It wore the skin of misunderstanding. It carried the weight of fear. It became the face we gave to those we refused to see. And yet, the Blemmye were not drawn as mere animals. Their bodies were clothed, their posture dignified. Their arms often held tools or weapons. There was a strange respect in the depiction, as though the artist sensed something real beneath the legend. That tension between dehumanization and reluctant admiration haunts the image. It speaks to a deeper truth. Even when people are othered, even when they are reduced to metaphor, traces of their humanity remain. They resist erasure. The monstrous body also served a practical purpose. It justified things. If the people outside Europe were not truly human, then conquest was not truly violence. It was salvation. If they were monstrous, then taming them was not cruelty. It was duty. And if they were lost, then to bring them under the banner of Christendom was not domination. It was rescue. The Blemmye did not just decorate the margins of maps. They helped shape the moral arguments for colonization long before ships left European shores. Their image primed the imagination for empire. But what if the maps had drawn them differently? What if the face had been placed not on the chest, but in its rightful place? What if the Blemmye had been shown smiling, reasoning, praying? What then? Would the maps have still held their power? Would the borders between us and them have begun to crumble? Perhaps. Or perhaps the maps were never meant to record truth at all. Perhaps they were dreams, structured into shape by ink and belief. And in dreams, the other must be strange. For the dreamer needs contrast. To know oneself, one must invent difference. Yet the Blemmye refuse to disappear into allegory. They hold their form through centuries, from Roman text to medieval chart, from cathedral carving to Renaissance curiosity. They persist, not because they were real in the biological sense, but because they answered a question Europe kept asking: who are we and what are we not? The answer, again and again, was drawn in the body of the other. So what does it mean to be monstrous? To have eyes on your chest? Or to refuse to see someone clearly? What is more terrifying, a distorted body or a closed mind? The Blemmye do not answer. They only stand, silent, watching, unchanging. And as you drift into quieter thoughts, let that image linger. A figure without a head, calm in posture, endless in implication. A symbol drawn not from truth, but from need. The need to mark the world. The need to control what lies beyond the map. The need to forget that the other was once a neighbor. Sleep now, gently, in the shadow of forgotten bodies. For the past is not dead. It watches still from the corners of old parchment, waiting to be seen again. Let us now return to the land behind the legend. Strip away the ink and the gold leaf, erase the dragons, and peel back the symbolic skin of the Blemmye. What remains? Not a monster, not a metaphor, but a question of flesh and dust. Who were they really? Were they ever truly seen? Or were they merely shaped by the eyes that refused to look too closely? It is here, in the dry heat of northeastern Africa, that the trail begins again. Not in myth, but in memory. In the forgotten margins of Roman campaigns, in the footnotes of Byzantine correspondence, in the overlooked shards of pottery buried beneath desert sand, there lived a people called the Blemmies. They were not headless. They had eyes, lips, language, homes. They built fortresses along the Nile Valley. They raided and negotiated with empires. They traded goods, carried beliefs, held ceremonies. They were fierce, yes, and proud. Their presence lingered in Nubia, in the borderlands of Egypt and Sudan. But to the Roman eye, trained in hierarchy and order, they were inconvenient. They would not be absorbed. They would not be erased. So, like so many before and after, they were made into something else. The Blemmies, real and living, became the Blemmye, monstrous and mute. It was not their bodies that changed, but the gaze cast upon them. It begins with a name, a slight shift in spelling. A foreign word passed through Latin mouths, scribbled by scribes who had never traveled south of Alexandria. A report from a soldier who fought in unfamiliar terrain, who glimpsed warriors dressed in cloth and armor strange to his eye. Perhaps he noted a curved shield worn across the chest. Perhaps he saw tattoos or ceremonial scars that struck him as unnatural. Or perhaps he saw nothing at all and simply repeated what he'd heard in a camp, over wine, by firelight. A rumor, shaped by imagination, hardened by distance. By the time it reached Pliny the Elder, it was no longer a rumor, it was a fact. And once written, the fact could not be unwritten. The Blemmye were fixed in the Roman world as headless men from Africa, walking upright with faces in their torsos. No matter that real Blemmies continued to live and die, to speak and resist, their truth became secondary. Their image became dominant, and from image comes belief. In the centuries that followed, the Roman Empire would fall, but the myth would not. The medieval mind inherited not just land and ruins, but stories. It inherited monsters. And with each retelling, the Blemmye drifted further from history and deeper into the fog of fantasy. By the time they appeared on European maps, they were no longer a people. They were a problem, solved by reducing them to a spectacle. Yet the question remains, why was the real version so unbearable? Why could the medieval world not accept that a people unlike themselves might exist without being monstrous? Why was the headless figure preferable to the complex, defiant truth of a culture with its own gods, its own time, its own wisdom? The answer, perhaps, is uncomfortable. Because it was easier to conquer an invention, easier to pity or fear a fiction than to understand a rival. The Blemmye were not feared because they were dangerous. They were feared because they made Europe doubt itself. What if civilization was not exclusive? What if God spoke in more than one tongue? So the people were unmade, their humanity translated into symbolism, their lives flattened into drawings, and somewhere along the way, their voices fell silent. But not entirely. In ancient ruins along the Nile, fragments remain. Walls bear inscriptions in Meroitic script, undeciphered, still hiding meaning. Tombs hold ornaments that tell of trade routes stretching deep into Africa and far into Arabia. And oral traditions in Sudan still speak of ancestors who were strong and strange, proud and misremembered. The Blemmies were real, and they remain real, not in fantasy, but in lineage. And yet, the colonial imagination found its uses. Even long after the medieval era, the Blemmye remained a reference point. 19th century explorers spoke of them with a wink, half believing, half mocking. The figure endured in encyclopedias and curiosities, fossilized in cabinets of European universities. Always present, never addressed. The image lingered, long after its original meaning was lost, as if the myth had more power than the truth ever could. So we ask again, were the Blemmye monsters? Or were they mythologized shadows of a real people who dared to live differently? Was the headless man a warning to travelers, or a warning to those unwilling to understand? What does it say about a culture that prefers its enemies faceless? What does it reveal about those who draw the maps? Let your thoughts settle into this quiet tension. Let the image of a nameless, headless man walking through the desert melt into the silhouette of a warrior, strong and upright, his face clear, his body marked by tradition, not terror. Let the myth dissolve, and with it, the need to distort the foreign. The world is wide. Not everything unknown is monstrous. Close your eyes now, as the lines on the map fade into sand. There, beneath centuries of misremembered ink, the real Blemmies still breathe, silent but never truly gone. History has a peculiar rhythm. What begins in wonder often ends in control. The first whisper of the Blemmye on the lips of Greek philosophers may have been curious, speculative, even reverent in a distant kind of way. But curiosity, in the hands of power, does not remain innocent. It mutates. It grows legs and learns to march. It is shaped into law, doctrine, sword, and conquest. And somewhere in that long transformation, the Blemmye stopped being a mystery and became a justification. In the ancient world, the monstrous races, Blemmye included, were not necessarily evil. Herodotus marveled at them. Pliny collected them like exotic specimens in the museum of his imagination. They occupied the same pages as plants that bloomed only once a century, or stones that wept blood. They were curiosities, strange but respected for their place on the distant edges of a diverse and dazzling earth. But as empire spread, as borders were drawn and redrawn in blood, the function of monsters changed. They became necessary tools. To conquer, you must believe you are better. To enslave, you must believe the other is less. And to civilize, you must imagine savagery. The Blemmye, drawn again and again as headless, mindless beings, fit perfectly into this moral architecture. They embodied disorder, non-reason, anti-Christianity. Their image was no longer simply unsettling, it was convenient. In the silent lines of the map, theology and empire found common ground. Here was the foreigner, made monstrous. Here was the justification, drawn to scale. Maps, once instruments of curiosity, became instruments of hierarchy. The known world was framed not just by coastlines and mountains, but by a moral gradient. The center was righteous, the edges corrupt. And the Blemmye, positioned at those edges, became part of the cartographic argument for domination. The logic was simple and cruel. If they were monstrous, then they could not govern themselves. If they lacked heads, they lacked reason. And if they lacked reason, they needed rulers. This is how empire thinks, in straight lines that bend others into submission. The Blemmye did not choose this fate. They did not write the stories. They did not draw themselves into history's margins. That was done by others, chroniclers, priests, generals, each adding a layer of distortion until the real people beneath the myth were obscured completely. And what of those real people, the Blemmies of Nubia and Sudan? They were already being squeezed between ancient Egyptian authority and Roman incursion, resisting assimilation while maintaining their sovereignty for centuries. They were not headless. They were strategic. Their knowledge of terrain, of trade routes, of diplomacy made them formidable. But this kind of intelligence was not useful to European mythology, so it was replaced with something simpler, cruder. The monstrous image won. And so, when explorers and missionaries followed the old maps into Africa, they did so with an image already etched into their minds, not of a man, but of a figure, headless, strange, foreign. An image that had been repeated so many times it had hardened into a belief. And belief, when tied to power, rarely allows for correction. It reinforces itself. It closes the door to truth. This process, the transformation of myth into policy, is not unique to the Blemmye. But in their case, the absurdity of the image makes the transformation especially grotesque. A headless man is biologically impossible, and yet that impossibility was not a deterrent. It was a shield. It protected the myth from scrutiny. It said, "This is not literal, this is symbolic." But what it symbolized was always weaponized. We must ask, how many lives were shaped by this image? How many encounters between cultures were poisoned before they even began? How many potential understandings were lost because the first thing drawn was a distortion? The map does not just show you where to go. It tells you what to expect. And if what you expect is a monster, you are not likely to find a friend. This is the danger of ancient curiosity, when it is not paired with humility. When the unknown is not met with questions, but with answers drawn too quickly, too confidently. The Blemmye may have started as an enigma, but they became a lesson in what happens when enigma meets empire. And yet, even now, the story is not over. The image lingers, but so does the possibility of revision. To see the Blemmye clearly, perhaps for the first time, is to question not only history's myths, but the myths we carry now. What distorted figures still sit at the edges of our own maps? What peoples do we still misread? Whose humanity is wept away by careless outlines? Tonight, let the dust of forgotten empires settle around you. Let the myths fall like dry leaves. And listen, beneath the silence, for the sound of truth stirring. A people once labeled monsters did not vanish. They endured. They adapted. And perhaps, if we are quiet enough, we can hear their voices rise, not in the language of conquest, but in the soft, enduring murmur of presence. In the hushed stillness of candlelit halls, where monks bent over parchment and quills scratched across stretched vellum like whispers in the dark, the Blemmye quietly crept in. not storming the pages, not roaring from the shadows, but entering instead with eerie calm. In the illuminated margins of medieval manuscripts, they waited, not on the grand stages of narrative, but just outside the lines of scripture. A headless man, with a face on his chest, standing upright beside saints, kings, and beasts of Revelation. To the casual eye, he might seem like decoration, an idle fancy of a bored scribe. But the margins were never idle. In medieval art, the margins were alive, and what they held was rarely innocent. To understand the strange persistence of the Blemmye, we must step beyond the map and into the margins of books, altarpieces, cathedral carvings, and stained glass. There, in the corners of sacred thought, the monstrous races reappear, not as invaders, but as reminders. Their forms were subtle, sometimes barely noticed. A miniature figure carved into a pew, a bestiary illustration no larger than a thumbnail, a grotesque face tucked into the crook of an illuminated letter. And yet, they were never meaningless. Every image had a purpose. Every body carried a story. And the Blemmye's body, by its very nature, spoke volumes without saying a word. The Gothic imagination, rich in symbolism and moral anxiety, was obsessed with the body. It saw flesh as both holy vessel and dangerous temptation. The ideal form was balanced, symmetrical, ordered. The monstrous body disrupted that order. A headless form was more than a biological impossibility. It was a theological rupture, a statement about chaos, about what lay outside divine order. And yet, there was beauty in the rendering. Artists did not depict the Blemmye as grotesque. They were often elegant, even noble in posture and composition. There was restraint in their monstrosity, as if their terror was meant to be meditative rather than explosive. Literature followed suit. In medieval texts, such as the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, the Blemmye appear as one of many strange peoples encountered in distant lands. Mandeville's fictional journey was widely read and believed for centuries, blending fact and fantasy so seamlessly that readers rarely distinguish between the two. He writes of headless men who live in the isles beyond India, describing them with an air of calm certainty. No shock, no outrage, just another entry in a world too vast to be comprehended through reason alone. The Blemmye, in his text, are not villains. They are part of the background hum of mystery that makes the earth more divine. This quiet presence in both art and literature reveals something deeper about medieval thought. It did not seek to eliminate contradiction. It held paradox with surprising ease. A creature could be monstrous and wise. A body could be wrong and still be part of God's design. The Blemmye, in this way, became a vessel, not for horror, but for contemplation. What does it mean to have a face where the heart beats, to see with the chest, to speak from the ribs? The question lingers like incense. And yet, the image also carried political weight. It was a soft reinforcement of difference. The Blemmye belonged to elsewhere. They were not threats so much as they were boundaries, bodies that marked the edges of understanding. To see them in the margins of a Bible or carved into a cathedral side was to be reminded of what lay outside the city, outside the church, outside the self. Not enemies, exactly, but not family either. Over time, their presence became ornamental, even playful. In late medieval manuscripts, marginalia often included whimsical creatures, anthropomorphic animals, and distorted humans in comic poses. The Blemmye joined this visual theater, sometimes dancing, sometimes hunting, sometimes praying. Their meaning shifted with context. They could be serious, silly, sublime. But even in their most light-hearted appearances, they never stopped being other. The joke, if there was one, was always made at their expense. Still, their survival is remarkable. Across centuries, across changing kingdoms and languages and theological battles, the Blemmye persisted. They outlived popes and kings. They migrated from the pages of Roman encyclopedias to the stained glass of English chapels. Their image passed through generations like a secret no one quite understood, but no one could bear to forget. And maybe that's what they became in the end. Not a myth to believe in, but a memory too stubborn to die. A symbol that refused to resolve. A figure drawn again and again, not because it made sense, but because it haunted something at the root of the Western mind. The fear of inversion, the mystery of difference, the possibility that truth does not always come with a familiar face. Let that thought settle over you like dusk. Let the soft light of manuscript gold reflect in your mind as your breath slows. The Blemmye are still there, quiet in the margins of old books and older fears, not roaring, but waiting, not warning, but reminding that even in a world mapped to its edges, there are still things drawn not to be understood, but to be remembered. Picture a lone traveler, weary from sun and sand, cresting a dune that divides the known from the unknowable. Behind him lies the familiar, a world of bread, bells, Latin, and law. Before him stretches a landscape both real and imagined, filled with voices he cannot understand, faces he cannot read, customs that refuse to match the sacred logic of his world. He sees a group of men in the distance, walking with proud posture, their heads wrapped in cloth or obscured by ornament. He squints. One holds a shield slung high across the chest, polished so brightly it reflects the light. Another wears a layered tunic, whose folds shimmer with patterns unknown to Western dye. Perhaps he does not see clearly, or perhaps what he sees cannot be easily translated, and so he returns home, and when asked what he saw, he says, "They had no heads. Their faces were in their chests." What were they really seeing? What did the Romans, Greeks, and later the medieval travelers actually witness when they recorded the Blemmye? The answer, elusive and murky, lies not in fantasy, but in perception. In the gap between the eye and the mind. The world has never lacked for wonders, but it is the lens we use that turns those wonders into either marvel or monster. Start with practical confusion. In the intense light of the Nubian desert, facial features veiled by linen or distorted by heat shimmer might appear misplaced. Combine that with body paint, ceremonial scarring, or even posture, and a figure can appear radically different to one unfamiliar with local customs. The Blemmies of Northeast Africa were known for their resilience and military prowess, often engaging in guerrilla warfare with shifting alliances across Roman and Egyptian borders. They wore armor crafted for the climate, sometimes thickly padded and layered around the torso. Their shields may have been worn high as protection from both enemy and sun. The foreign observer, untrained in their language and ways, might misinterpret these details not as cultural variation, but as physiological aberration. Then there is the matter of language. In translation, nuance often drowns. The Greek word akephalos simply means headless, but in context, it could refer to social status, invisibility, or anonymity. In battlefield reports, soldiers might describe enemies as like headless men, meaning ferocious, faceless, unrecognizable in the chaos of war. But by the time that phrase reaches a scribe in Rome or Constantinople, it becomes literal, and from there, it is immortalized in manuscripts and maps. Human memory is not a mirror. It is a canvas. And on that canvas, the brushstrokes of fear, awe, and cultural superiority often paint over truth. What the medieval map makers and writers believed they were recording was the world's diversity. But what they were truly drawing was the outline of their own imagination. To see the Blemmye not as a mistake, but as a reflection of perception, is to begin untangling the deeper knot, not of monsters, but of misunderstanding. There are accounts, too, of cultural performance. Nubian dances and rituals involved elaborate movement, torso undulations, gestures that placed emphasis on the chest and shoulders. In a foreign eye, used to European forms of body expression, restrained, symmetrical, focused on the face, this might appear strange, even otherworldly. Add to this the stories passed orally between traders and sailors, each adding a detail, each exaggerating slightly, and you arrive at an image that begins to harden. A person, still human in outline, but stripped of face, stripped of identity, placed just far enough from the self to become myth. Even art and sculpture may have played a role. Early Egyptian wall reliefs often show figures in profile, with chests unnaturally emphasized. Could a quick glance at such a carving, half decayed, weathered by centuries, suggest to a traveler that the face was misplaced? That the eyes gazed not from the head, but from the body? It sounds absurd, but then again, history has never been careful with its conclusions. It leaps, often without proof, from observation to belief. But perhaps the most unsettling answer to what they were really seeing is this: they were seeing themselves, distorted in a mirror held by the unknown. A headless man is not a monster. He is an absence, a symbol of disconnection between heart and mind, self and other. In that way, the Blemmye became not just a foreign body, but an internal metaphor. What if the Blemmye were a projection of what Europe feared it might become if untethered from its rules, its scriptures, its sense of superiority? What if deep down, the headless figure was not so much an observation of the outside, but a warning from within? These questions do not close the story. They widen it. They invite doubt, curiosity, humility. The Blemmye refuse to rest neatly in one category. They are too strange for science, too persistent for myth, too human to be ignored. And that is what gives them their eerie power. So let us not dismiss the ancients for their errors, nor pity the medieval world for its maps. Let us, instead, see their stories as lanterns, dim, flickering, imperfect, that still try to illuminate the vast terrain of otherness. And as you breathe softly into sleep, imagine a lone figure walking the line between legend and truth, his face calm, not monstrous, but misunderstood. Let the question echo, unanswered. What were they really seeing? Sink a little deeper into stillness now, as we step past what was seen and into what was needed. For in the architecture of belief, not all myths arise from error. Some are built on purpose, crafted like stained glass, each shard fitted to catch and shape the light of the world into something safer, more knowable. The Blemmye were not simply figments born of confusion. They were functional. Their presence on medieval maps and in the folds of ancient texts was no accident. It was necessity. Europe, in its medieval form, needed headless men. But why? What makes a culture, a continent, invent a figure so absurd, so anatomically impossible, and then cling to it for centuries with quiet conviction? Not just as a campfire tale, but as a theological fact, a geographical detail, a cultural warning? The answer lies in the emotional scaffolding of the medieval worldview, in its longing for order, its fear of inversion, and its relentless need for difference. To be human, in the Christian imagination of the time, was not merely to walk upright. It was to be made in the image of God. And that image had a form: 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head lifted toward heaven. The head was the seat of reason, of language, of prayer. It housed the soul's ladder. To remove it, even in fiction, was to strip a body of its divine channel. And so, the headless man became more than a curiosity. He became a warning about what happens when the spiritual connection is severed. A being that sees with the chest, speaks from the ribs, and walks without guidance. It is not just monstrous, it is spiritually inverted. Medieval Europe, after all, was built upon the architecture of opposites, heaven and hell, light and dark, Christian and heathen, order and chaos. The world made sense through this binary prism, and anything that could not be clearly placed within it had to be reshaped until it fit. The Blemmye, like other monstrous races, were the raw material for this reshaping. Their strangeness was too useful to discard. They were molded into moral geography, evidence that far from the center of Christendom, the natural order decayed. Bodies bent, faces fell, humanity unraveled. But there is something deeper still, something quieter, darker, more human. What if the Blemmye were also a projection of internal fear? Not fear of the foreign, but fear of self. The medieval world lived in a delicate balance. Plagues roamed, empires cracked, church and crown jostled for dominance. The mind was a fortress under siege from the body, its desires, its betrayals, its reminders of mortality. To imagine a man without a head was, perhaps, to imagine life stripped of the burden of thought. No guilt, no doubt, just instinct and function. A terrible kind of freedom. This tension between order and desire, between the mind and the flesh, plays out again and again in medieval theology. The Blemmye became the ultimate metaphor, a man who lives without the very part that makes him moral. A walking body, detached from conscience, a soul misplaced. And in a world where temptation was seen not as external, but as erupting from within, such a figure carried enormous symbolic weight. So the Blemmye were needed, not just by mapmakers and monks, but by every trembling heart that feared it might someday fall from grace. The headless man was a boundary marker, both geographic and psychological. He stood at the edge of the known world and the edge of the soul. He was the frontier between salvation and collapse. And still, the image is not angry. It does not rage or accuse. The Blemmye is not drawn with fury, but with calm, as if resigned, as if quietly enduring the role assigned to him. He is not monstrous in pose, only in implication. That stillness is what makes him unforgettable, because it suggests that he might not be lost, only labeled, that he might not be chaotic, only misread. And perhaps that's the real reason he had to remain headless, because to return the head, to restore the face, would be to grant him identity. And once that happens, the binary collapses. Once you give the other a name, a voice, a reason, they are no longer monstrous, they are you. So Europe looked away. It froze him in ink and stone, faceless yet familiar, and moved on. But the image never left. It followed the mapmakers west, into the New World. It whispered to colonizers, explorers, missionaries, offering the same justification it always had. What lies beyond is not quite human. What lies beyond must be tamed. And yet the Blemmye never needed to be real to matter. Their utility was not in flesh and blood, but in metaphor. They gave shape to fears too delicate to name aloud, and in doing so, they became permanent residents in the subconscious landscape of empire. Now, as you drift into sleep, let that image soften. The headless man, standing alone on the edge of a forgotten map, not as monster or warning, but as a question. What do we become when we look away from others? What do we lose when we refuse to give the unfamiliar a face? The answer, like the Blemmye, waits quietly at the edge. History, like breath, moves in cycles. What fades is never truly gone. It settles, it sleeps, and then, under new skies, with new names, it stirs again. As Europe emerged from the long shadow of the Middle Ages and stepped into the shimmering light of the Renaissance, its maps began to change. The old theology was no longer enough. Curiosity was reborn. Trade expanded. Ships sailed past the edge of what had once been known. The monsters, one might imagine, would now vanish, banished by compass and telescope, reason and rediscovery. And yet, the Blemmye, headless and watchful, endured. Not because people still believed, but because belief had taken on a different shape. In the Renaissance, the world expanded faster than understanding could follow. New coasts were drawn with trembling ink, new continents labeled in Latin letters, and strange peoples encountered for the first time were quickly classified through the prism of older fears. The monstrous races from medieval bestiaries did not disappear. They were revised, rebranded, and occasionally resurrected. In the blurred line between mythology and anthropology, the Blemmye found new life. The Renaissance was obsessed with the classical past. Ancient texts, once sealed in monastery walls, were rediscovered, translated, and circulated. Pliny the Elder returned, not as a dusty curiosity, but as an authority. His accounts of the Blemmye were copied into printed volumes, now distributed across Europe with mechanical ease. No longer locked in illuminated manuscripts, the image of the headless man now moved freely from library to drawing room, from cathedral to university. Renaissance readers did not take the Blemmye as literal truth, but neither did they fully discard him. Instead, he became something else, a symbol of the strange, the distant, the not quite civilized. There is a Renaissance map, engraved by Sebastian Münster in the 16th century, that shows the Blemmye once again, standing calmly in Africa, face centered in the torso, arms relaxed. Münster was not a medieval monk. He was a scholar, a humanist, a printer. Yet there he placed the Blemmye, not as fantasy, but as data. The legend did not die with reason. It was archived, preserved, given a new frame. And why? Why would a world awakening to science, astronomy, and exploration still make space for a headless man from myth? Because myth, unlike fact, adapts. It seeps into new forms. It becomes metaphor for the things knowledge cannot yet resolve. The Blemmye were no longer proof of spiritual decay, as they had been to the medieval mind. Now, they represented mystery itself, things that had not yet been seen, but could be. The Renaissance believed it was on the brink of discovering everything. And in that belief, the monstrous races became placeholders, provisional truths in a rapidly shifting world. Yet something else had changed too. The The Renaissance did not simply inherit the monsters of the Middle Ages, it inherited their logic. As empires expanded, so too did the need to categorize, rank, and control the newly encountered. The Blemmye may have faded in name, but their function remained. Strange bodies were still drawn, dissected, and discussed in travel journals and natural histories. Reports from Africa, Asia, and the Americas described people in terms that echoed the monstrous races. Too tall, too short, too dark, too decorated. Heads were not missing now, but dignity often was. And in art too, the Blemmye made curious reappearances. The grotesque became fashionable. Renaissance painters filled the margins of their canvases with hybrid beings, exaggerated forms, twisted anatomies, not to scare, but to provoke thought. The monstrous became a lens, not of fear, but of fascination. In this new context, the Blemmye became less of a warning and more of a question mark, a relic of human imagination that had not yet found peace. Still, their persistence reveals something more than artistic nostalgia. It suggests that even in an age that prided itself on rational discovery, certain fears and fascinations remained untouched. The unknown was no less thrilling. It was simply dressed in new robes. And so, the Blemmye walked on, not in forests or deserts, but in the minds of explorers, readers, and thinkers who still needed symbols for what they did not understand. There is something tender about this. The Renaissance did not entirely reject its past. It carried its monsters with it, folded into the expanding scroll of the world. The Blemmye became part of the grand human tapestry, not as proof of deformity, but as evidence of continuity. That even in our most enlightened moments, we remain storytellers. That even in the age of maps and measurements, we are still haunted by the shape of a man with no head, whose eyes see from the chest, whose presence demands that we ask again, what does it mean to be human? So let that image drift gently through your thoughts. Let the sounds of parchment and printing presses fade into stillness. The Renaissance, for all its brightness, cast long shadows. And in those shadows, the Blemmye walked on, uninvited, unexiled, unforgettable. Close your eyes and imagine a map, not ancient, not medieval, not even drawn by hand. A digital map, rendered in pixels and algorithms. A satellite's eye tracing highways and rooftops with precision, labeling every square of Earth with names, borders, codes. The monsters are gone. The oceans are charted. The continents are no longer covered in the fog of speculation. And yet, something remains, not in the shape of the land, but in the shape of our minds. In the way we still divide, categorize, and defend the known from the unknown. The Blemmye, headless and haunting, are not dead. They have changed form. They have migrated into the modern world, not as creatures, but as patterns. For what is a monster, if not a reflection of what we fear? And what is fear, if not a map of what we do not yet understand? The Blemmye once stood at the edge of parchment, marking the limits of Christian Europe's confidence. Today, those limits look different, but they still exist. They exist in the stories we tell about distant places, in the headlines that frame unfamiliar cultures with suspicion, in the language we use to describe the other. The monstrous races are not drawn in ink anymore. They are drawn in metaphor, in bias, in silence. The face in the chest has become symbolic of a world that still refuses to see clearly. When a group is stripped of its complexity, when a culture is reduced to caricature, When people are flattened into symbols of danger or primitivism, we are still drawing Blemmye. We are still placing faces where they do not belong, not because others have changed, but because we have refused to. And so, in a quiet, unsettling way, the Blemmye have survived the fall of empires and the rise of satellites. They no longer walk deserts. They walk discourse. They linger in assumptions. They live in the gap between what we know and what we think we know. And just as medieval maps used them to mark the edge of order, modern narratives use their ghosts to mark the edge of empathy. Consider how the unfamiliar is portrayed in film, in news, in textbooks, often simplified, often exaggerated, often stripped of self-definition. The monstrous body is no longer a torso with a face. It is a symbol of marginalization. And once again, it serves a purpose. It allows the center to feel justified. It says, "Here is what we are not." It draws the self by erasing the other. But this time, the echo carries a choice. We are no longer bound by the ink of ignorance. We have access to each other in ways the medieval world could never imagine. We can speak across oceans in moments. We can listen to languages once silenced. We can see faces once hidden by fear. The question is not whether the Blemmye still exist, but whether we are still drawing them. And here is the strange beauty of their legacy, the very absurdity of their image. The impossible anatomy, the headless calm, invites doubt. And doubt is where change begins. When we look at the Blemmye now, with all we know, we are forced to ask not, how could they believe this, but what in us still wants to believe in monsters? The Blemmye remind us that fear is not ancient, it is perennial. That the desire to simplify is not medieval, it is human. And that the work of seeing clearly is never done. We carry old maps in our minds, even as we scroll through new ones. Some borders are visible, others are invisible, but all of them can be redrawn. So let the image rise in your thoughts again, this time softer. A figure walking the edge of a forgotten coastline, not headless, but misunderstood. Not monstrous, but misread. Let him remind you that the world is still wide, that even now, stories are being told about places we refuse to understand, and that within each of those stories is a chance to pause, to look again, to replace fear with curiosity. Drift now, deeper, into a world without borders. Let the maps fade. Let the monsters rest. For in the silence, a new vision begins, not drawn in ink, but in understanding, not written by empires, but by those once placed at the edge. As the world lies quiet around you, and your breath slows into rhythm with the hush of memory, ask softly, not just who the monsters were, but who needed them to be. Every story ever told carries weight, not only in what it says, but in who says it, who listens, and who stands to gain from the tale. Monsters do not exist by accident. They are built, brick by careful brick, with the mortar of fear and the scaffolding of control. And the Blemmye, strange and silent, face in the chest and gaze turned inward, were no different. They were constructed to serve, not themselves, but those who drew them. So let us ask the harder question now. Who benefited from the image of the Blemmye? Who slept more soundly knowing there were headless men at the world's edge? The answer, quiet but firm, begins in the center. In the cloisters and courts, in cathedrals and palaces, where power needed the world to be ordered, ranked, explained. A world where difference was not a curiosity, but a threat. A world where the unfamiliar needed to be reshaped into something manageable, something dismissible, something less. The Church, holding the pen of doctrine, found in the Blemmye a symbol of what lay outside salvation's reach, a reminder to the faithful that to stray from orthodoxy was to fall into distortion. To live without the head was to live without divine reason. To exist beyond the body of Christendom was to risk the slow erosion of the soul. The Blemmye became visual theology, printed not in sermons, but in shapes. Monarchs, too, had their use for monsters. Empire feeds on difference. Conquest requires a reason. If those across the sea are not like us, if they are headless, faceless, monstrous, then taking their land is not theft. It is order. It is bringing light into shadow. The Blemmye served as a convenient prelude to colonialism. They reminded rulers and merchants alike that the maps were not yet full, and that the edges belonged to no one, at least, no one who mattered. Even scholars, even artists, even the poets and chroniclers gained something from the monster. They inherited a role, keeper of mystery, guardian of the known. To describe the Blemmye was to hold knowledge, even if that knowledge was false. To repeat the myth was to be part of something larger. The repetition itself gave weight. And with each stroke of ink, the figure of the Blemmye grew less like a person and more like a tool. And what of the ordinary believer, the villager who never traveled farther than the fields beyond their church steeple? What did the Blemmye offer them? A strange comfort, perhaps. A way to name the distant. A way to believe that evil had a place, far away, not here. That the world could be understood, if not by fact, then by fear. The monster gave shape to unease. It offered form to that quiet dread that the world was vaster than Scripture could cover. So yes, the Blemmye served many, but they served no one more than the story itself. The great story of civilization versus savagery, of center versus margin, of face versus faceless. And that story, even today, still finds new monsters to place at its edge. To question the Blemmye is not simply to doubt a medieval fantasy. It is to disturb the deeper structure, the one that says, we are whole, they are lacking. The one that says, we are the image of God, they are the distortion. And in disturbing that structure, the question ripples outward. Who else has been drawn as monstrous? Who else has been rendered faceless to keep the rest of us calm? For the Blemmye are not merely old symbols. They are archetypes. They are the idea of the unknowable turned into a shape. And until we stop needing monsters, we will keep inventing them. New forms, new names, always standing just far enough away to avoid being known. So rest now, with that awareness gentle on your thoughts. Let it move like wind across old parchment. Let the edges of the world grow quiet again. And if you hear a soft footstep, if you glimpse a figure in the margin, do not be afraid. It is not a monster. It is the shadow of a truth once hidden. Sleep lies close now. The breath has softened. The world of iron and fact recedes behind you like a fading shoreline. But before you drift fully into the quiet, let us ask one last question. The one that was never asked by the map makers or the monks, the scholars or the sovereigns. The question not of what the Blemmye were, or where they lived, or how they came to be etched into the trembling margins of belief, but this: what if they were never the strangers? What if the true strangeness did not lie in the desert beyond the Nile, nor in the exaggerated silhouette of a headless man, but within the minds that needed him to exist? What if it was not the Blemmye who were distorted, but the vision of those who claimed to see them? Consider it now, in the soft hush of thought. A face in the chest is an inversion, yes, but so is every projection born from fear. When we look outward with judgment, we twist the world. When we refuse to listen, we misplace voices. The Blemmye were labeled as monsters, but they left behind no stories of monstrosity. It was Europe that wrote their silence. It was Europe that feared not what they saw, but what they might have to acknowledge if they saw clearly. Because to truly see the Blemmye, to look past the myth, the ink, the centuries of repetition, is to recognize a very different story, not of monstrous anatomy, but of human misrecognition, not of foreign threat, but of local need. They were drawn to stabilize a center that felt unstable, to offer comfort where doubt brewed, to serve as placeholders for everything not yet understood, or worse, understood too well and pushed aside. And yet, for all the distortion, they remain. The Blemmye have endured in the way only misunderstood truths can, silently, insistently. They wait in museum cases, tucked into maps that no longer chart the world, but still trace the fault lines of old ideas. They wait in the footnotes of colonial history, and in the side glances we still cast at the unfamiliar. They wait, not for discovery, but for honesty. Because if the Blemmye were never strangers, then we must face the stranger inside ourselves, the one who judged before knowing, who erased before understanding, the one who mistook distance for difference and difference for danger, the one who, fearing the edge of the map, decided to fill it with monsters. So let that truth settle gently now. Let it fold into your thoughts as dusk folds into night. The story is not about a headless man. It is about how we see, about how we draw the world, about how we decide who belongs in the center and who is left in the margin. Perhaps the Blemmye never wanted anything. Perhaps they were just there, living, breathing, misunderstood. Perhaps the real question is not who they were, but who we were when we chose not to see them, and who we still are when we choose silence over recognition. Now let go. Let the maps close. Let the old borders fade. There are no monsters here, only memory. Only the long, quiet breath of history exhaling its final image. A man walking upright. His head is not missing. It is returned. His face is clear. He gazes not at us, but past us, into a world yet to be drawn with truth. Sleep now. You've reached the edge, and beyond it, something else waits. Not fear, not myth, just the beginning of another way.